In lieu of having slept a long portion of the day yesterday, and even sleeping most of the night away, I decided I would just go ahead and do this today. I had made 2 community posts and associated pinned comments as it relates to what I'm about to discuss here, as it all pertains to the whole Kherson issue and what's going on there, and how that actually is going to relate to the soon and coming full-scale invasion, and a couple other issues that I'll tie into it. But I had looked at the maps, and I read between the lines in some of the reporting that was attributed to this, and I found a lot of inconsistencies. And what it seems like to me is, well, it seems like a lot of things, but it seems like there is a concerted effort to maintain a certain level of OPSEC, or operational security, on the Russian side of things, because they are busy and they are active. They are active because it would seem to me that because they've been building up these forces in the north, in both Belarus and in Russia, in the whole Belgorod-region, for a broad sweep to the south, that no, they are not freezing this conflict. They cannot freeze the conflict. I had put a video up of Gonzalo Lira I listened to this morning, and even before I went to sleep yesterday, I listened to the Duran channel, who had a man on there as a guest. Now, I didn't agree with a lot of the things that their guest had to say. I think his name is Garland Nixon. I didn't agree with a lot of what he had to say. I think he is, like, flat out wrong on about, like, I'd say maybe about 50, 60% of everything he had to say. So I just sort of wrote that off. But it does seem like a lot of people believe, and I have to say kind of falsely, that Russia is trying to freeze the conflict. They are not trying to freeze this conflict. You do not do a buildup of the scale that they're doing to do nothing. You don't do that. And I'm going to show, I made a little bit of renditions. They're kind of cheap, but you'll have to bear with me just to sort of convey what I'm talking about when I go over what I'm about to go over, as it relates to Kherson and what's going on there, and how that holds up as far as it relates to the overall agenda of preparing for their full-scale invasion. Now, in Gonzalo Lira's video, I agree with most of what he said. Not everything, but most of it. And yes, for a general to just declare that, hey, we're going to withdraw troops, and then 3 days later, you just all of a sudden have withdrawn troops, and you remove the city's population, that goes together with what I had said in the 2 previous lives, as it pertains to a similar situation like I've depicted in my story, as it relates to, like, the urban battle part of it. Now, in my audiobook, that is, there are 3 sub-stories within that one greater story. Now, what you have is you have the battle, which is a large urban battle going on in the cap city, and you had most of the population being relocated beneath the city to its subway systems and sewers and maintenance tunnels and drainage tunnels, so on and so forth, because they had tried to get their population relocated safely out of where the fighting was to take place. Now, similar in concept was the Russians evacuating the city's population from Kherson back to safer places behind their prepared defense lines. Now, they are masters, the Russians are, of something called the deep battle concept, or layered defense lines, where they have learned to use this effectively back in World War II as the Nazis were invading the USSR. Now, the deep battle concept involves having multiple well-prepared defensive lines that, as one line falls and you grind your enemy down some, you withdraw behind it to even more prepared defense lines, and then when that one falls, you pull back behind it to yet more defense lines. Now, in my story, I conveyed a little bit of this as it relates to the battle that happened in the Cap City, D to the C, where they had 3 defense lines. The first one they didn't have enough time to well prepare it as much as they'd have liked to, but what did they do? They pulled behind that to the second line. And the second line was really their best line out of all 3 lines. The last one being more of like a sort of Alamo type of line, like a last stand sort of a line, where there was nowhere left behind there to go to, really. I mean, they have to put up their best fight there. So you can consider what's happening in Kherson region to something like that, but on a smaller level. I mean, it's not. It just has to do with this specific region, and not so much like the whole of Ukraine, because there's other battles going on in other places that involve other things, some of which are more mobile than others, like in Kharkiv, how that they have, they've ceded ground here and there only to return to it and take it back after shelling the shit out of the Ukrainians when they'd come in to capture empty land, And, Gonzalo Lira's right, because I was going to say this too. Keep in mind, the Kherson is at the far south of the nation. It's along the floodplains, the alluvial plains of the Dnieper River and others. There's other rivers located nearby, and the terrain it's varied. It's very varied terrain. There's a lot of different terrain features. Now, we are still in the time of year where in Eastern Europe, they have the Rasputitsa rains, where it makes the soil it's a type of mud. It's a thick mud to a level where very heavy vehicles have a propensity to become very stuck. The Germans had a big problem with that when they invaded the Soviet Union. Now, because by the time fall had come around, they were starting to suffer that. And toward the end of November, when the grounds began to freeze again, they could move again, but then they had a new problem. And the new problem was that not only had they had the issue of being stuck before in the rains, but now the ground was frozen, and their uniforms and other equipment wasn't well prepared for the level of cold experienced in the USSR in the winter. They then had a problem with their equipment not working properly and their troops succumbing to frostbite because they invaded the USSR in the summer and they entered in their summer uniforms. They thought that they were going to have a quick victory, that this wouldn't be a prolonged conflict, and lo and behold, they're still fighting in the wintertime and could not get their winter gear fast enough. Now, that's what hubris and pride and arrogance can do to an army, and it happened to the Germans. Now, the Germans were beating that ass. Oh, yeah, the Germans were whooping that ass. They were whooping the Soviet Union hard. But, see, they planned for a quick victory and not for a long and drawn-out war of attrition, something that the Russians they have a long history of doing. Not just to Napoleon, but just in general. The Russians are used to fighting long, drawn-out wars of attrition. That's their style. That's what they do. Because they have a lot of territory, and they've learned how to trade territory for time. But that's not what I'm talking about in this particular case. I'm talking about the territory in this case that they have withdrawn forces from is territory that is highly susceptible as territory on a floodplain of being very muddy, unattractive ground to hold. Now, the city of Kherson is not in Ukrainian hands. Now, there are villages around it that are, but the city itself, no, it's not in Ukrainian hands. And the Russians still actually have a defense line around the city proper. I'm going to try and show this rendition I drew to the best of my ability to where I can try to make this make sense for you. Now, here's what I drew here. Now, this is like, this leads into Crimea right here. This right here is the mainland, and this is like what leads down into Crimea. There's islands down in here, and then it sort of like goes like this. But I'm focusing on this area specifically right in this box. There's Mykolaiv at the base of the, can't remember which river this is, but this is the Dnieper River right here. And the Dnieper is a very wide river in certain parts because there's a lot of reservoirs in that river. Big, humongous reservoirs. Now, here's Nova Kakhovka. Nova Kakhovka is another city that's roughly about the size of Kherson. And this here is the land that the Russians are withdrawing from. Now, it's an orderly withdrawal. It's not like the news is calling it, where it's, you know, like there's an actual big battle being fought there when there's not. Because right now, again, there's a lot of issues here with the terrain becoming very muddied, and it's not ideal to hold. So here's the Russian defense line right here that would be something like this, once again. So here's the road. It'd be something like this with your Czech hedgehogs, your concertina and barbed wire fencing, your anti-tank ditches, your minefield all around those, another layer of sea wire, barbed wire, trench systems. Higher up, then you have machine gun nests so they can shoot over the trench systems and their troops can shoot up out of the trench systems, and even higher, so you got trenches running between that and the anti-tank nests where you would have things like Kornet missiles. It's a very well-prepared series of defenses. Now, you would have such things around the city proper. Let's see, there's the river. Now, this is sort of like just muddied, nasty, you know, fields right here that they're withdrawing their forces from. Now, the lines that they have here, like the outermost forces they have out here, those are not being used to their best effect. So they're withdrawing them across the river to these other lines, but they've not withdrawn all of them. I think that's what is being missed by a lot of people. They have not withdrawn all of their forces from the city yet. And I don't know if they're going to or not, because I wouldn't call this a trap, but I would call this a diversionary move, because if you're moving forces to better prepared defense lines that are across the river, and you still have some here, it looks like they're tempting them to come into this muddied, nasty area, try to bog them down, because they're not in no hurry to come over there to the city. Now, the Russians withdrew all their populations knowing full well that this city could become a battleground. Why would you leave your own populations in a place that you intended on making a battlefield? It's sort of like in my audiobook. The Americans, aside from the people they conscripted to build these hastily built defenses in the city, they withdrew people underground to keep them out of the way of the fighting. So they withdrew their citizens of Kherson out of the battle space. They withdrew them further back and out of the way. Now, what I know of this specific area, see, these are battalions. Now, remember, in the east, there are 70 combat battalions of Russian army, and I'm not counting the 300,000 plus whatever, however many extra troops it might be that they're building up in the north, but we know for sure it's 300,000. That is the rough equivalent of 6 whole combined arms armies. Now, the forces that have been active in this area here belong to the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, which is out of the 58th Combined Arms Army. There's also the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade, which has a few battalions in this area. Now, these aren't whole units that have all their battalions right here. These are just units that have some of their battalions rotating in and out of this specific area. So these aren't like, there's not a whole division, there's not a whole brigade, and there's 2 divisions that are rotating forces that belong to them into this area and out of it. Same with the Coastal Defense Brigade, the 126th. Now, the other division is the 7th Guards Mtn Air-Asslt Division, which is a Russian airborne division. And the 22nd Army Corps, I guess that's an independent corps that doesn't belong to any group, or I'm sorry, not group, combined arms armies. That's where the 126th Coastal Defenses Forces are coming from. And the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division is coming from the 58th Combined Arms Army. So the 42nd Motor Rifle Division, the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, out of these 14 battalions that are in this immediate area, within this box, box right here, there are 14 battalions operating in this area. Out of the 14 operating, 8 of them come from the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, 2 come from the 126th Coastal Defense Brigade, and there's 4 battalions that come from the 7th Guards Mtn Air-Asslt Division. So that's only 14 battalions in this area. So they're occupying this area. I just arrayed them how I would imagine they would be arrayed now that they've withdrawn from this area. I put some on the flanks so that if they do decide they want to enter the area to fight this defense line around the city, these guys can hit them from the flank while they're running up into all these defensive lines. This would be like a perfect pinning action and I drew a general thing. I mean, I'm not in the map room, so I don't know what kind of prongs of attack they're preparing for these massive, big invasion armies that they're putting together. But just as a for instance, I drew this just to give an idea. While all this stuff is happening down in Kherson at the very far south of the country, you'd have in the east, you'd have these other battalions in the east arrayed around here, and these green dots would be like Ukrainian forces. This is just a for instance. This isn't like absolute. This is a for instance, just to show the concept I'm trying to highlight here. Now, while they would be bogged down, this big strike force they put together, while they'd be bogged down in the far south, if they did actually commit to a battle in Kherson, which I'm sure they're trying to lure them into one, to pin them down here and in the east, while they're being pinned down in Kherson because they've committed to it, I'm sure they will, they're going to attack across a broad front from the north and take whatever remains. So, I mean, this is just like a for instance. This isn't absolute. This is just what I could imagine them doing. They're putting together these massive invasion forces up here. Now, keep in mind, you have the Pripyat marshes up here. So it's marshy ground. It's not ideal. So you would have them sticking to roadways. But once they'd get through the Pripyat marshes along the roads, then they would fan out and start, taking other areas. Now down here you have the mountains, of course. You have the Carpathian Mountains down in this area. So you'd have the marshes up here and the Carpathians down here. But once they got through all that, they would start fanning out and, cutting off the west. And then they would, of course, take the capital and once they moved from Belgorod up here, they'd start splitting down and, taking the center of the country behind the Dnieper River here. So, they'd be coming down to outflank the eastern forces. I couldn't draw the whole country on that sheet of paper. I couldn't fit the whole east of it, but we know the east is largely occupied by the Russians right now. So this is just a for instance. While they commit to Kherson, which would be like a massive pinning operation, and I think the Russians are giving out confusing information on purpose because that's what generally happens in war, because you want to lure your enemies into attacking at your time and place. You don't want them to commit to a battle of their choosing. You want them to commit to a battle of your choosing. So what better? If I was a war planner, I'd be doing the same thing, because where is this? This is at the far south of the map. I'm not talking about Crimea because I don't count that. I'm talking just of what's left of Ukraine. This is at the far south of the map, okay? So if you get them to commit here, this big, whatever remains of their forces that they've got left that they could slap together into some sort of a strike force, and you get them to commit here, then these humongous forces can come in largely unopposed. I mean, I had to put a little bit to protect the capital, of course. I had to put some up here, But largely, these would be small forces. These wouldn't be these massive forces because they're so laser focused on fighting in the east. Here you'd have like Bakhmut, and up here you would have like Kharkiv, and down here, you'd have whatever else, and then Kherson here. I mean, but most of the whatever forces they have left, they wouldn't be anticipating that. If they committed to fighting all the way down here, redeploying those forces to the north would be next to impossible. That would be next to impossible. So it makes a lot of logical, rational, coherent sense from the planning of a much larger operation. Because while that's all happening down here, you have these layers of defenses. You got more defense lines that are better prepared across the river, while you give up this ground that's in the brown, slashes here. Your first defense line might not be the best of all the defense lines, but you kind of want it to be that way because you want them to think, after they've maybe come in right here, you want them to think that they really achieved something. That you want them to fight for it, try to capture the city, and by the time that they've fought through this weaker line that you've withdrawn troops behind, now keep in mind, you withdrew troops from this line. Of course, you're still going to leave some, but it's sort of like what the Germans did at the Battle of the Zalo Heights, when the Germans knew that the Russians were going to pound their front line. So they withdrew troops behind their front line to their second and third lines, let the Soviets pound the bottom front line, and then as they crossed the Oder River, the second and third line behind it were pounding the enemies that were crossing the Oder. And I'm talking about the Battle of the Zalo Heights toward the end of World War II, before the Battle of Berlin. This is like very much the same concept. Now, they moved all their battalions out. They left a little screening force, like a screen. They leave just enough troops to act as a screening force to protect the, outer parts of the city. While all these battalions that had been in this area, they moved them out of the area, behind the lines. They left just enough to act as a screen to lure them in, to make them want to attack. And then when they get this whatever strike force that they've put together, when they get them to commit, then they fight the screening force. They get in, get the city. These guys launch a savage artillery barrage and hit anything that got stuck out here in the mud or whatever made it into the city. The city's going to be a war zone. That's why they evacuated the civilian population with the military. I mean, I'm sure, of course, there's some people that, volunteered to stay behind because they didn't want to leave. You know how people are. Some people are like, oh, I'll never leave my home. I'm not going to leave my home. People have done that throughout the history of warfare. But by and large, most people have been evacuated because the Russians anticipate this to become a war zone. Peskov, one of the leaders of the Russian regime, has said that they will never give up Kherson. They will never give up Kherson. So then why then did they withdraw troops? I mean, it's simple, really. I mean, it's simple logic. It's very simple logic. Because they know that they are putting together a strike force. They want them to commit those forces into battle of their choosing, pin them down here, so that while they're pinned down here, their big invasion forces can sweep down when they're finally complete. Now, 2 weeks ago, I said that it's probably going to be 2 weeks to a month before the ground freezes and they're going to do their big operation. You know, it could even be longer. I said that too. It could be longer. It could be longer. Who knows? They might not. I mean, they might wait 6 weeks or maybe 8 weeks. I don't know. I don't know what they're planning. But I know that you don't put together 300,000 troops to do nothing. When we invaded Iraq, we used 160,000 troops to invade Iraq in the first 3 weeks, the first 3-week invasion phase, where we were defeating Saddam's armies. Saddam Hussein, when we were defeating his army, we used 160,000 ground troops. That was the invasion phase. Now, if you're going to put together 300,000 plus whatever all you have in the east, the 70 combat battalions, the 63 to 65,000 men, if you're going by average Russian battalion sizes, that is a massive force. These guys here are part of that 70 combat battalions that's in the east. Because this is the east right here. This is Kherson is part of that whole eastern crescent that runs all the way from there, all the way up to Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are losing in Bakhmut. They're losing in, a few other areas along there. So they're hungry for a victory. What better than to tempt your enemy into having one here, that they could have a made-for-TV type of victory, where they can be seen rolling into the city, and the newscasters can be like, oh, after heavy fighting, which is total bullshit, because the Russians withdrew a large portion of their forces behind the river here. They could say, oh, after heavy fighting, they roll victorious into Kherson, because they need a morale boost right now. They need a morale boost bad. But the fighting won't be over, because once they do enter the city, these guys are going to lob a whole shit ton of artillery at them, and then they're going to counterattack across the river. It's just like what they've done already in Kharkiv a few different times, where they'll move out of an area, let them move in, they'll hit them heavy with artillery, and then they'll counterattack and move right back on in and take it. Do it all over again. This is like classic military tactics 101. I mean, it's people aren't thinking about the whole tactical end of it because people don't care about that. They only watch news reporting and they believe what the news media tells them, even though the news media is not talking about any of this type of stuff. They're not giving any of the details. They're not explaining it, how this stuff works to people, because people don't care about that. But I care about that because it's important to understand which way this is going to go, and that this is about to be wrapped up very shortly. And by very shortly, there's no way you put together 300,000 troops to freeze a conflict. It doesn't happen like that. It doesn't work like that. All those forces they put together up here in Belarus and in Russia, you don't put together forces like that only to never use them. They're not going to freeze this conflict. This is right on their borders. They have to bring it to a conclusion of some kind. So, yeah, they might be pausing to try to get them to commit. They might be waiting on them to commit to something and to make some kind of greater plan come into fruition, like for their overall invasion, coming down from here, whatever that might look like. This is just a for instance. I just drew all this as a for instance, but it's all going to revolve around wherever they have their forces deployed, whether it's like, they got some around their cap and they got some in the east. It's all going to hinge on wherever they've deployed their forces, what type of intelligence they've been able to ascertain about that, and whether they could get them to commit to fighting more here in the east. Because remember, these guys are laser focused on fighting the Russians in the east. So how these guys attack with their invasion forces is all going to depend on how many of these guys and where they are, and if these guys have, committed here or not. Because right now there's a grand strategy occurring and unfolding, and in Kherson, something is going on, definitely. Because there's a lot of conflicting information coming out. A lot of conflicting information. Because these guys, these Russians, they have spent way too much time preparing defenses in this whole area for them to just... Because remember, keep in mind, this is the entrance, the ground entrance to Crimea, which is now part of Russia. This is ground entry into Crimea. They're not going to just abandon a city that they've been holding without fighting over it. And they're not going to give up territory that is that close to the entryway into Crimea, because they need to have supply lines for the civilians who all live in Crimea, and for the naval base that they've got there, all the forces that they've got down there right now, all the forces they have further east, like in Mariupol and other areas. They are not going to give up Kherson without a real fight. They're trying to lure them in to some kind of a battle, like a set-piece battle that they cannot back out of. They're trying to get them to commit forces and commit them down here into a grind-down sort of a battle, whereby once they're committed here in Kherson, they're stuck. They're stuck. And they're not going to be able to redeploy those forces when all of these forces come down in a broad sweep, That's how it works. They're not going to do that. There's no way they're going to do that. Because look, when you have built all of these defense lines, you're not going to just give up your defense lines willy-nilly without a fight. Yeah, they might have it to where, they'll leave a little bit of troops in their first defense line so that they can lure them into a battle. But once they're committed, they're committed. They're going to lob artillery at them. If they get a bunch of forces out here stuck in the mud of the alluvial plains right here, they're just going to be sitting ducks. Because the logistical movements, especially on a side that is becoming highly depleted in everything and has to ask the West for aid, logistical resupply is not easy by any stretch of the imagination for these guys, because they have to get everything from the West. And not only have their resupply been, their trains and trucks and everything else and depots been hit by Russian missiles and, hit from the air, but once you commit them to a battle, they're going to be pinned down. They're going to be stuck. It's a pinning action. It's pinning. Just like what they did in Kiev to pin forces down in Kiev while they moved forces further east into the east. They pinned forces down up in Kiev at the very beginning with their tiny little, their rinky-dink little aviation, their air-assault regiment, their 104th Air-Assault Regiment, their 104th Guards Air-Assault Regiment, and their battalion of Spetsnaz. You're not going to occupy a city that has over 2 million people in it with 4,000 troops. So, a lot of people that don't understand the size of the forces that were sent to occupy those key nodes in Kiev, They thought it was like a full-scale attack to take Kiev, and they didn't realize that Russia had sent in a very, very, very small force to occupy airports and air bases, which are like key nodes, you know, in the suburbs, to intimidate the Kiev regime and also to make it seem like that, you know, that they were going to try and conduct a later attack, because if you occupy the airports, those are logistical hubs. That would be where you would fly in logistics, you know, your supplies, ammunition, maybe artillery in some instances, because you can offload the shells off of those massive cargo planes, whatever else. So they're occupying these key nodes. And that created a lot of anxiety at the time for them. So they pinned down a massive amount of forces within their city and around it. So while they were doing that, the Russians moved into the east. But what I'm saying here, this would be a pinning action of a different sort. When these guys commit, and they're now bogged down trying to, you know, hold this city after they spend some resources to take it, their logistics will be committed for the troops that they have in this area. Their troops will be committed. Vehicles will be committed. They won't be able to redeploy all that stuff willy-nilly, and they won't be able to do it on time to stop all these forces that are taking the roadways. See, they need to buy time for that because of the Pripyat marshes are such nasty marshes. The only thing running through them are well-made roads that, you know, are on embankments, you know, well-engineered roads that can pass. That would be the only way that heavy forces would be able to cross through this region. So it makes a lot more sense now why they would also want to do this. Because if you have to move through the Pripyat marshes with like armored divisions or whatever else, mechanized infantry, those would be easily defensible places for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians could easily defend those roads because everything would be funneled through those roads, at least until they could get farther south and fan out. But if you have all those forces pinned down here, you don't have to worry about that. You've bought yourself enough time to get through the Pripyat marshes. Does that make sense? And then your forces can fan out. You can take the country. Geography has a lot to do with what's going on there right now. Everything to do with it, really. The soil, the quality of the soil, the Rasputitsa rains, turning it all to mud, marshes in the northwest. There's mountains down here, like the Carpathian Mountains. So this would be like rocky terrain down here, or like elevated terrain by the borders with Hungary and Slovakia, southern Poland. But up here, it's the marshes. It's the marshes. And they have to get through the marshes to be able to fan out once they get deeper in the country. The Russians know that, so that's why they have to draw them into a battle here. Get them to commit. And while they're committed, then they don't have to worry about the rest. That's why they've spent all of those months preparing defense lines, very well prepared defense lines, like so. You know, get all these forces to commit, get them stuck, grind them down even more than they've already been ground down. Because a lot of people don't understand. They have already made tons of attempts to take this city before. And they threw themselves on the Russian defense lines, and the Russian defense lines broke their backs. They broke their backs. So the Ukrainians are understandably suspicious that Russia would say, oh, well, we're just going to go ahead and withdraw troops from this area. They're suspicious, and they should be. They should be. Because this is going to be a disaster for them if they commit to it. But if this doesn't work out, and they don't get them to commit to this, somehow, some way, it'll be somewhere else. It'll be somewhere else in the east. They'll pick some other area to do it if they don't take the bait for this. But we'll see how it goes. But they're going to use layered defenses to grind them down, fire artillery with their artillery batteries belonging to their artillery battalions. They're going to fire a shit ton of artillery into this area. It's a lot of mud down in these alluvial plains. Tanks, heavy vehicles will get stuck. if they have any. Their troops will get stuck. It's not ideal to be able to have to cross muddy ground like that to attack a prepared defense line. It is not ideal to do that at all. Movement will be really slow. You'll be prey to artillery, air attack. You'll be prey to, the defense line itself as you get closer into it, and the machine guns and the troops in the trenches and anti-tank positions can hit your vehicles or your troops. Yeah, you don't want to have to deal with that. So yeah, last I heard, there's about 14 active battalions in just this region. 14 out of the 70 total combat battalions that are throughout the east of the whole nation that Russia has already annexed. Remember, they annexed Kherson too. They're not just going to willy-nilly give up Kherson like that. Everybody should know that. Everybody should know that. Just off a general principle. Why would you give up ground that your troops already fought and shed blood to capture? If the Russian regime is saying that too, that we're not going to just give up Kherson, but also is doing conflicting messages, like saying they're withdrawing troops and abandoning the city, something is up. Something is seriously up with that. So I am showing you the most likely thing that is up with all that. I'm explaining it with visuals so that people can understand it. Because you don't do something like that unless there's a purpose behind it, militarily speaking. Especially after for 7 entire months, you use defense lines to repel attack after attack after attack, only to then withdraw troops. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? Unless you were trying to pin your enemy down. Why would you do it? See, it makes no sense. Makes no sense whatsoever. So, the only other thing I was going to talk about was that now, apparently, besides all the narratives surrounding all this nonsense, apparently, people are mistaking it for freezing the conflict or this or that, and they're not going to do that. They're not going to freeze this conflict. They have built up way too much for an invasion to freeze this. But I heard also that apparently we fired some kind of missile into the Arctic as a threat to Russia, and you're going to see a very carefully crafted narrative, psyop type of deal in the coming days. You will. You absolutely will. And, I will say that about Gonzalo. He was right about that. Like I said, I didn't agree with everything he said, but he was right about some of it. And you'll see a lot of narratives and psyops coming out. And they'll be coming from the West, but they're also going to be trying to distract people too. Because as soon as something goes wrong, not just with this here in Kherson, but as soon as something goes wrong and you have the Russians doing their full-scale invasion, then it'll be on to the next thing. It'll be on to the next big distraction. It'll be on to the next big distraction. And I'm not even saying that a type of false flag is totally out of the picture yet, because it might not be. False flag attack might not even be out of the picture yet, but I don't see the Russians, like I've said before, I don't see them waiting that long to finish this whole thing. It wouldn't make sense to me. Yeah, sure, maybe 2 weeks, maybe however long it takes them to bait their enemies into committing somewhere, but I don't see them sitting on their, plans for too long. It might be a few weeks, that'll put it within that 1 month time where they're waiting for the ground to freeze, but I just don't see it lasting a whole lot longer. I mean, it could last a little longer than that, but generally that's what I see. See what everybody's saying here. But this is going to be a short one because that's generally what I planned on addressing. I had already said most of what I wanted to say yesterday anyway in my community postings, so between this combined with some of the other posts, should get the point across pretty clearly what's going on here. Hey, Miriam, and God Beholds, and Just Man. Yeah, they're not going nowhere, Just Man. It's all a bunch of nonsense. See, the West has no idea what they're really doing, of course, because Russia keeps OPSEC. They keep operational security. They maintain operational security. They give out purposely conflicting information and say nothing about it because they have very detailed plans strategically and tactically that they're going to pursue. Why would any army, I mean, other than ours sometimes, like we've done in the past, but why would any, I mean, we've fought little pissant enemies, like little weak enemies like Iraq and Afghan, like it's like we could get away with that, but they are actually fighting the West. Not just the proxy of the West, but they're fighting the West itself because we're the ones that are so gung-ho on supplying this proxy nation that, they're fighting us. So they have to keep their OPSEC about them if they want to have any chance of victory. Because, while they are strong enough to pull it off, there's still a lot of limitations because of the geography that they're facing, the underdeveloped road networks, everything. There's all kinds of factors that come into play. When you're trying to save as many lives as you can of your own side, of your own forces, then you have to maintain OPSEC, We didn't have to worry about that as much from the Iraqis or Afghans. We could have people at the Pentagon standing up there at their little podium talking about, they're going to do this, they're going to do that to the news media, but Russia doesn't do that like our leaders do that because, and part of me thinks that, it's like at this point, everything that's done in the West is like a publicity stunt. I don't even look at, everything has to be made for TV because everything is about the narrative. Everything is about psyops. Everything is about propaganda. I do not support Russia or China, but I'm speaking the truth. It is about publicity in the West. It is about, look at the news cycle. They don't ever give it a rest. They're trying to put it in people's minds what the narrative is because they want you to parrot the narrative. That's why it's called the Mockingbird media. People forget about Smith-Mundt. People constantly forget about Smith-Mundt. It's crazy. It's absurd. It's out of control. And people forget about it. And anytime you're in a time of war, there's always going to be war-related propaganda, and you're never going to get the truth. Never. This is like Goebbels level stuff in Nazi Germany that comes out in the news media. This is like Goebbels level stuff. It's absurd. It flies in the face of what's really actually happening on the ground. It's like how toward the end of World War II, the Germans would be like, oh, we're winning the war. And it's like, no, the Soviet army is like 200 miles from Berlin. But they'd be like, oh, we're winning the war, and soon everything's going to turn around, and it's going to go our way. And, because Germans, they to give them credit where it's due, they were whooping that ass at the beginning. They were stomping the USSR like it was nobody's business. But because of their racist ideologies, like toward the end, they didn't want to admit that they were being beaten by the USSR. So the things they would say would like fly in the face of conventional knowledge about what was really going on, and they would say things like, "Oh, we're winning the war. We just need a little time," and just crazy, absurd things like the type that we're seeing right now as it relates to a proxy conflict of all things. This isn't even like. It might be considered an existential threat for Russia because this is happening on their borders, but for us, we have no business being involved in this. But we support this whole thing so vigorously, It's hurting us. It's at our expense. It's draining our military. It's draining them of vital stocks they would need for a massive war. And it's stuff that cannot be replaced. It can't be replaced because it would take years, and that's under ideal, regular, ordinary circumstances. It would take years. It would take 7 to 10 years for a lot of these items to be replaced. Not added to, replaced, meaning what we have given away just to reboot those numbers. Not even add extra, just to replace what we've given away. It takes 7 to 10 years for most of the munitions. It's absurd. It's absurd. We're draining our capabilities for a proxy. And our supply chain is on the verge of breakdown, total breakdown, which will affect totally, plus all the foreign suppliers we depend on too, for our higher tech weapons, like our enemy China. We're breaking our own backs. We're depleting ourselves. We're becoming a backwater. So, yeah, it's absurd. It's absurd. For a proxy conflict. Yep. Well, anyways, everybody had a blessed day and have a blessed day. And I'm going to get going here. I just wanted to do a quick conversation. I said I would do this yesterday. I slept most of the day. Just got up recently, so just knocking this out. But you all have a blessed day today.